Welcome to Nole, the official podcast of the College of Arts and Sciences at Florida State University. I'm your host, Amy Walden, and on today's episode, we welcome Barry Falk, Professor and Associate Chair of Curriculum in the FSU Department of English. Barry, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
It's a pleasure.
So on today's episode, we're diving into Barry's research across modern literature, popular music, and media, as well as the countdown to America's 250th anniversary. So Barry, can you tell us a little about your background and how you first became interested in studying English?
I was interested in English literature and English studies from the very beginning, but it wasn't an exclusive interest. I went to school at University of South Carolina. I kind of was naturally gravitating to my English classes, but also my history and my philosophy classes. And I think it had a lasting impact on me in that while I'm interested in literature as a specific thing, I've always been interested in the way it intersects with life, and in particular with historical issues and broader issues about meaning and philosophy. So I've always thought about literature as a subset of larger issues. And only recently, maybe, I got interested in the specific things that literature can do that other artistic forms can't.
Yeah, your research is really fascinating, and I'm excited to dive into some specifics of that
Sure.
in just a moment. You earned your PhD in English from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Can you tell us about your early career and what brought you to the faculty here at FSU?
Well, what brought me here was the wonderful capitalist free market workplace. This was the first place that hired me, and I've been fortunate enough to have my entire career at the FSU English department. I've had wonderful colleagues over the years, and I'm still working at a place full of just bright, creative people. And another thing is, I think that their research mission has always been an important part of every cohort that I work with. But I think there's been a special pride and a special interest the faculty have had in the teaching mission of the university. And it's something that makes me proud to be a part of.
Well, we're so glad that you're here, and it's really cool that you've spent your whole career here so far. So your research spans a lot of different topics, but it also focuses in on specific musicians and songwriters. Can you talk about some of the artists or bands you've studied or teach about in your classes?
Well, I thought maybe the best way to talk about this is to tell you a little bit, and I had to do some reflection on this, about how I got interested in the relations between music and literature more specifically. My dissertation was on a late Victorian form of entertainment called the music hall, which is similar to, if you've heard, and people might be aware of the term variety theater, variety shows, or back in the day, it was a television genre of the variety show, and also American vaudeville. It's kind of, those are the brothers and sisters of the British music hall. And the British music hall was a kind of craze, kind of a hip thing for literary intellectuals. So I'm a Victorianist by training, and there was a sort of craze for the music hall as a kind of cool way of very popular form of entertainment and amusement. And specifically literary intellectuals, especially poets, were very interested in the forms of music hall and music hall entertainment because they were thinking about analogies between what performers do, what musicians do, between music and the effects of literature and what poets do using literary form. And then basically, although I was a Victorianist, I was frequently asked to talk about 19th century and 20th century British literature, more contemporary literature. And that phenomenon of the 1890s really continued into the 20th and 21st centuries, where a lot of literary figures, and in my particular generation, I was interested in, when I was in graduate school and first beginning to teach British literary classes, there was Hanif Qureshi, Nick Hornby, Roddy Doyle, and these were writers who were like the Victorian intellectuals that I learned about and wrote about for my dissertation in my first book. These more contemporary writers like Doyle and Qureshi, they were fascinated with British popular music or popular music in general from the 60s onwards. And they were kind of doing the same things that a much earlier generation of literary intellectuals did. They were imagining analogies or homologies between their writing and the life of a writer and the life of a musician. And also they were alluding to, and this is something that may be more specific to contemporary British writers, is that in general, writers like Doyle and Hart and Hornby and Qureshi and many others, Zadie Smith, they were making frequent allusions to music and sort of incorporating lyrics and making references to popular music in their writing. So I guess it was my literary studies that made me interested in the intermedial range that encompasses music and literature.
It's
If
really
that makes
cool.
sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's really cool to see how much those two go hand in hand.
Overlap. Yeah.
Yeah, which brings me perfectly to my next question. Some folks might look at your courses or areas of research and think to themselves, you know, this sounds like it would be College of Music or Department of History, but it's Department of English. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your work really
Well, you
centers
do
around
me an
English?
honor in thinking that for a minute, the history department or musicology department would necessarily enter what I'm doing. But I'm not trained in their methodologies. Although I've worked and been on committees with many wonderful colleagues in musicology and in history, but my methods are different. And it's a testament to, some people feel this is a weakness, but I actually think it's one of the glorious things about the literary field, or, in our program, literary media and culture in the English department. One of the great things about literary studies is that it allows you to talk about culture and the ways in which even huge things like music and literature, they're huge in their own right. But if you talk about culture, you're allowed to think about the interrelations between these phenomena. And you can talk about the exchanges between the different fields. And I think that's one thing that I try to do, and that I think being in an English department allows me to do, or licenses me to do. So
That's a great answer.
yeah.
That's exactly what I think a lot of people were wondering about. So, you've authored several books and essays diving into everything from, as you've mentioned, Victorian literature to Bob Dylan and David Bowie. What have been some of your favorite fun facts or interesting tidbits that you've come across when studying these various areas and icons?
Well, I did some preparation for this, and I have some fun facts. I'll share some fun facts about Bowie first.
Yes.
This is one of the things the students notice as soon as you start studying the iconography, and Bowie is a visual icon and someone very interested in the visual arts as well, and theatrical arts. And so one of the first things the students notice is that he had a permanently dilated pupil. And has pupils of a different color. He got into a fight in his early school days over a girlfriend. So that's a fun fact. And maybe that's a prerequisite for every rock star. Another thing, and this is something that I recently was fortunate enough under the rubric of pop music and literature. That's one of our sort of interdisciplinary study courses, general ed courses in the English major. And I was lucky enough to focus on Bowie. And one of the things I talked a lot about, and this is maybe less known, but it is a fun fact about Bowie, and it's also a way in which he's really relevant. He was kind of way ahead of the curve in what we're doing right now. He was ahead of the curve in media studies, especially in the internet. He was very much an internet pioneer. He's, I think, the first major artist to have tried to sell his songs online. He was doing this in the early 90s when nobody was even thinking about it. And he had his own website that was very advanced for his time in the 90s called Bowie.net. And this is one of the ways I sort of stirred my current interest in Bowie. One of my current projects is writing about David Bowie as a media theorist. And I'm incorporating my study of Bowie with a study of a writer, but also very much a nascent amateur media theorist, William S. Burroughs, and thinking about the ways in which they were engaging and thinking about internet culture really in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Burroughs is thinking about the internet really in the 70s and the possibilities of alternative media in the 70s. He influenced Bowie, but Bowie got his own groove going on in the early 90s. So I think that's not only a fun fact, but I found that a very helpful way to interest students in Bowie. As far as Dylan is concerned, I guess the lesser known fun facts would be the fact that Dylan has a pretty thriving career as a sculptor as an artist, but also as a sculptor. He wields iron gates, and increasingly he's been having international exhibits of his artwork. And another fun fact is that he's been garnering the accolades since he won the Nobel Prize in 2016. And so he's, I think, the only major musician that I can think of who has won an Oscar, a Nobel Prize for Literature, and a Pulitzer Prize. So, and a Grammy. So that's a lot.
Quite the resume.
Yeah, quite a resume.
Well, that's great. I just learned so many fun facts that I'm going to share at my next get together. So you also host the Critical Media Studies podcast with Michael Rapici, a professor in the Department of Communications at St. Petersburg College. What was the initial inspiration for starting the podcast, and what kinds of topics does it touch on?
Well, this is actually where my interest in David Bowie was rekindled, and my interest in the writer William Burroughs, especially his basically proto-media theory, a wonderfully insightful and provocative and challenging collection called The Job. It actually started in this reading group that I had with my former student, Michael Rapici. Michael was actually a student of mine in a literary criticism introduction course that we still have in the English major. It's about 27 years ago. And then we started doing a media studies, just reading group, and we were meeting on Zoom during COVID era. And we were just excited by new books by the French philosopher and media Bernard Stiegler and some other sort of new media theory books. And we wanted to know more about media studies and media theory. And then sort of going back to the dark times of that initial COVID year, we're going to go dark here for a second. I didn't know what was the future for anything at that time. And one of the things that generated our interest in doing a podcast and turning the reading group into a podcast is I was uncertain about the future of education. But I did feel that podcasts were emerging as this amazing teaching tool, an amazing communication tool. It still is, right? And I had an apocalyptic feeling that maybe the old ways of conveying information weren't going to make it much longer, and that we better find new ways of communicating. And my apocalyptic dreaming, I have to say, I think I was still half right in the sense that I do feel AI technology, podcasting technology, it is remaking. I saw that you had Michael Neill on an earlier episode of Nole Edge. And there are many ways in which the future is absolutely refiguring, reformatting everything we're doing in the humanities. English departments certainly not accepted. Michael teaches at a community college in St. Petersburg, and we were both interested in this as a kind of quasi-pedagogical exercise.
And you can do it from afar. You said
and we do it from
remote,
afar.
So
Yeah, we've
really
always
fun.
been doing it on Zoom. First, we did the reading groups on Zoom, and then we decided to have the conversations, basically have the conversations and share the conversations on all the available streaming sites. At first, we used to have whopping conversations of over an hour. And then I think we realized this was probably too much of a great thing. And so we started to, try to be disciplined in the conversation. But as you know, I think this is an art form, what you're doing. This is an art form. Like in any art form, you have to develop some practical knacks, right? And you have to find the right way to walk the tightrope, right? The most exciting thing about the podcast is that it's free-form conversation. Mm-hmm. But too much of a free-form conversation is not a good thing. So you have to learn to be balanced. Another thing that's been really interesting, or that we've developed and that I'm proud of, is that we've try to achieve a balance in another way in terms of our content, and that we try to balance new things, new developments in media theory or media studies. We've had maybe too many episodes on AI and how AI is challenging the humanities and everything else. But we also try to have a Wayback Machine episode where we revisit thinkers who are sometimes, 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, sort of pre-digital media theorists like Marshall McLuhan and André Bazin. One of the things we focused on with André Bazin is, even though he made his name in France as a film theorist, he was interested in the intermedial space between television and film, and has and there was a recent collection of his writings on that area about sort of intermedial affairs and things that television and film do differently, and their interchanges, and also imagining a kind of future for film that looks a lot like the digital future for film. So we try to go back and forward in our content as
Yeah,
well.
it's really cool how many times you've talked about the future and people might think of things as being so far in the past, but so much of it is predicting what's
So
next.
much is right,
It's really
right.
neat. So we mentioned earlier in the show that we're coming up on the United States celebrating the 250th anniversary of its independence, or the semi-quincentennial. Say that 10 times fast.
Wow. You than me on that.
So when we look back at American literary, musical, and pop cultural history and the many different areas your research specifically has explored, what are some of the overarching themes that you've noticed, and how do you expect these to either endure or shift in the future?
Well, this is a great question. I did some thinking on this. I jotted down some notes. You tell me what you think about this, but I'll share my thoughts. To me, the more, or maybe one of the most remarkable things about the American music tradition is, I mean, obviously, it's been a constantly shifting story. And speaking of media and technology, the new digital media streaming landscape for music, the end of the record company, the end of the recording studio, really, for all practical purposes, or the hegemony of the record companies in the recording studio. Those are huge game changers. So there are many, 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 many new things, and really disruptive new things, challenging new things. But, in thinking about your question, I'm also struck by the strong continuities, and I'll identify two of them. The continuities strike me as being as fully remarkable as the changes. So one of the continuities is American music has always been a kind of hybrid genre. The strongest component, and arguably, I think most musicologists, here I'll defer to the musicologists, I think most musicologists would say that American music is not a single thing, but is a kind of stream, that there are at least three streams of music. The predominant element, I think, is the African American musical tradition and African American music techniques, but Latin American rhythms, especially in the 20th century, and continues to be, a major player in that musical landscape, along with European folk traditions. And along with the European folk traditions, I would also mention the 19th century orchestral tradition. It's impossible, and it remains impossible, to talk about American music as a unitary thing. It's always about genre blendings, the controversies that are formed by genre blendings and genre mixes and genre confusion. And it's always been sort of a confused and an excitingly contradictory thing. So that's one continuity, and that I think is going to continue. And then you're talking about celebrating, and I can't even pronounce it. What was it? The sesqua.
Semi-quincentennial?
Yes. Well, celebrating that. There's another irony or continuity, maybe, an ironic continuity, in that American music, I think a lot of American music is always about celebrating America. I mean, it just is on a variety of levels. So much of American popular music, 19th, 20th, and 21st century, is about celebrating America, the American dream, ideals of freedom and individualism, the joys of community, whether or not that community is small town life. Think of how many songs there are about just celebrating small town life. Conversely, think of the dozens and dozens of songs that are about celebrating the neighborhood or the big city, right? So these are just like, that's not going to change either. And there are dozens and dozens of songs that are about American places, not just the land, not just American nature and American landscape and the American environment, but also man-made landscapes like highways, and the dozens and dozens of songs that come out of Route 66. So I think, one of the continuities in American music is that American music is going to continue celebrating them, almost doesn't need holidays because or temporal markers to celebrate, because it's always kind of celebrating itself.
I've never thought about that specific notion before, and now I'm going to look at my playlist in a whole new light.
Count how many small town songs you have in there. So,
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's a lot.
That's so fun. What upcoming projects or research are you working on currently?
I'm very busy, but some of this busyness is on managing things. So I'm working on the Bowie and Burroughs project and media studies project that I mentioned, but I'm also editing a collection on the music novel. Considered as an international phenomenon. And one of the things, and so I have a collection of scholars from around the world, actually, who are contributing this topic. So it's an exploration of of that in-between area between music and literature, considered from a variety of national perspectives. I'll just give one example of it, because one of the things you find out once you look at the music novel as a worldwide genre is the way things don't necessarily map out the way you might expect. So one of the contributions is talking about the contemporary avant-garde experimental Chinese writer Yu Hua. And Yu Hua is an experimental writer and interested, like many of the writers in the collection, in the ways in which musical form can provide an analogy for literary form. But the musical forms that Yu Hua is interested in adapting and thinking and writing through are primarily taken from he's also very influenced by French literature. And his musical touchstones aren't Chinese folk traditions or Chinese music as much as 19th century, late 19th century French composers like Debussy and Satie and the early French modernists. So this question of literary influence and music influence and mutual influence works out in surprising ways as you trace it across the globe.
That's really neat. We're definitely going to have to tune into
I
the
hope so.
Critical Media
I hope
Studies
so.
podcast to stay tuned on what you're working on.
I hope so. That would be great.
So, Barry, we end every podcast with our bowl of mystery questions. So
this is
please-
the part I'm scared of.
No,
here,
nothing
but-
to be afraid of.
All right. Let's see how well I improvise here. Okay. Oh, what is my biggest irrational fear?
Oh,
You know what? I have an easy answer, and it's grounded in today's weather report.
okay.
I have an irrational fear of thunder.
Oh, okay.
So
well,
this was a
rational, I
stormy
think.
day. This was a stormy day, although the storm, it seems to have passes
Yes.
over without too much. But severe thunderstorms, that's my biggest irrational
Florida's
fear.
the lightning capital. So
I know. How had
not
I
that
made it this so
irrational.
long here? I don't know. I don't know. Lucky, I guess.
Hopefully the bad weather is over
Yeah.
for today so we can get you back safe. Well, Barry, thank you so much for
It's been
joining
a
us
pleasure.
on Knowledge. And if you would like to learn more about Barry Falk's research or the FSU Department of English, visit english.fsu.edu. Thanks for tuning into Knowledge. We'll catch you next time.